It's good to see everyone back this evening. That passage just a moment ago, and you might be actually turning over to the book of Exodus, but that passage that we read together from Colossians, that is an interesting passage. And what we're going to be talking about tonight is the Ten Commandments, or the Ten Commandments. But in that passage in Colossians, it talks about the handwriting of requirements. Uses that phrase, the handwriting. That word handwriting, when you look it up, it's actually the word for graven, is the idea. So you might think about what is being alluded to with that figure. Because as we think about the handwriting of requirements, that which was graven, I would suggest it might be alluding to the Ten Commandments themselves, perhaps. The ministry, as it's called in the New Testament, the ministry of death engraved on stones is actually what it's called. It's an interesting passage there in Colossians. We're going to come back to it at the end of the lesson. But like I said, we're going to talk about the Ten Commandments tonight. And you might, like I said, turn to Exodus. So you have the Ten Commandments. They were originally given at Mount Sinai. Of course, here you have in Exodus 20, you have one accounting. In Deuteronomy, you have the other telling of them, the repetition of the law, the second giving of the law. So you have these two lists, and you would like to think that they're exactly identical. But there's actually subtle differences between the Exodus account and the Deuteronomy account. We're going to look at it. Sometimes it's just a single word, but other times it's actually a whole idea. And we'll see that as we go along. I wanted to begin just by reading from the Exodus account. Exodus chapter 20, verse 1. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, nor your son, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. So, I understand we're familiar with the passage, but I want you to just think about these Ten Commandments in general, and a few different points that we can make. I thought I'd start with this, and the reason I wanted to read it, do you see how simple it is? It really is simple. You know, let's see, what is today? April 18th? I know they pushed back tax day. Anybody in here do your own taxes? How complicated is the tax code? It is horribly complicated. Just horribly complicated. Compare man's laws very often with God's laws as they came down from Sinai. It is very, very simple, and I would suggest it was simple for a reason. Here in Exodus, look over at verse 20. Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, so that you may not sin. Oh, okay. So the Lord is testing them, right? Okay, so that's what this is about. The Lord wants to know who wants to have that special covenant relationship with him, right? So he's not going to make his law overly complicated so that people have trouble figuring it out. He's going to make it very, very simple. Right out of the gate, it is just amazing here as we have the Ten Commandments. You just have the simplicity of it. Moses says, the Lord is testing you. A little bit later on, look over in chapter 24, when you have Israel affirming the covenant. And I understand you have more of the law being given and such things as that. But in chapter 24 at verse 7 it says, Then he took the book of the covenant and read in the hearing of the people, and they said, All that the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient. And Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, This is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you, according to all these words. The people said, We will obey the Lord. And you're thinking, well, that's great. That's wonderful. Everything's going so smoothly. And yet just a few chapters later, what are the people going to be doing down at the base of Mount Sinai? You're going to have the golden calf account. As there, they make that golden calf, and we're going to read it here after a little bit. But here in chapter 24, the people say, everything the Lord has said, we're going to do it. Okay? And from the very beginning, what we read there in Exodus chapter 20, Moses says, God is testing you. He wants to know who is going to follow him. And the people say, yep, sign us up. That's what we're here for. We want to follow the Lord. And within a few chapters, they're building a golden calf. And it just makes you back up and say, guys, were you not listening to the Ten Commandments in all of their simplicity? There in verses 4 and 5, you shall not make yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or that is in the earth beneath. Verse 5, you shall not bow down to them nor serve them. Was that complicated? Was that hard to understand? No, it's pretty simple. It's pretty simple, yet the people still turned away so quickly from God's simplicity. Even today, as you think about the Ten Commandments, even today, even among those who claim to follow the Ten Commandments, it's actually amazing what gets broken. I wanted to show you something. This is from a website. You might be able to see at the top. It's from beginningcatholic.com. It's just a Catholic website. That's all it is. And to look at the top, it's this page. It's just all about the Ten Commandments. The Catholic Ten Commandments are a summary of the conditions of a life freed from the slavery of sin, Catechism 2057. We won't read the whole thing. Notice that paragraph, what's Catholic about them? How big is that? Can y'all see that? Let's see if I can blow it up some. Actually, I do want to blow it up. When you look at this page, I want you to notice, get back there. What's Catholic about them? I want you to read that first sentence. While the entire Judeo-Christian tradition uses the same scriptural content for the Ten Commandments, their exact division and numbering varies. Now, slow down right there. This isn't complicated. So why would something so simple, why would people have trouble with the exact division and the numbering of the Ten Commandments? Now, this is here are the Catholic Ten Commandments. And I'll just let you look at that list. And as you're looking at that list, you might be glancing back in Exodus. All right, it starts off, I am the Lord your God. Okay, Exodus 20 verse 2, I am the Lord your God. Number 2, you shall have no other gods before me. Okay, they skip down to verse 7. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Notice what's not on that list on the screen. Do you see anything about any carved images? You see anything up on the screen about that? It's not there. But you might notice number 9 and 10, they split covetousness up. Because if you just pull one of the commandments out, well, how many people have heard of the 9 commandments? Well, we can't have the 9 commandments. It's got to be 10 commandments. So if we're going to pull one out about the carved images, we're going to have to do something about that. So we'll split up that last one about covetousness into 2 commandments. Presto changeo, you got the 10 commandments again. Now, as you think about that, why would you eliminate one of the commandments? Why would you do that? It's pretty simple. It's laid out there in black and white. Why would you pull that one commandment out of there? It's because it doesn't agree with what you do. It doesn't agree with what you teach. If you leave that commandment in there, there's going to be a lot of people saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be bowing down to statues of the Virgin Mary. Maybe we shouldn't be bowing down to the statues of any number of saints. Maybe we shouldn't be bowing down and doing those things. And as much as they say, well, they're not worshiping, they do worship Mary, by the way. They kiss the statue Mary. They claim that she is the mother of God and that she is worthy of worship, frankly. But if you leave that commandment in there, that's not gonna sit well with them. So they take it out. I wanted to show that to you just so you could see. Even among those who claim to keep the 10 commandments, how quickly do they turn away from them? Even as Israel said, we'll keep the 10 commandments, how quickly did they turn away from them? God's laws have always been simple. Go back to the Garden of Eden. How difficult was it? Okay, you can eat of any tree. I noticed, did y'all notice the trees are planted in back? Dan, where's Dan at? Dan, did you plant the trees? Huh? He had some help. How many trees are back there right now? 24 trees altogether. If I said, okay, everybody, let's assume they're fruit-bearing trees. We can eat the fruit of any of those trees that grow except for the one in the far back right corner. We can eat the fruit of any other tree except for that tree. Any questions? Because that's what the Lord told them. You can eat the fruit of any tree except for that tree, the knowledge of good and evil. Was that complicated? And yet Eve was deceived, it says. The devil deceived her. The 10 Commandments, pretty simple. Come up to the New Testament. Just think about worship. Think about salvation. The Lord's Supper, is it real complicated? Our singing, is it real complicated? Gathering on the first day of the week, our assemblies. I would suggest we take the simplicity of our assemblies for granted, and sometimes it gets us into trouble. But when you look at the Bible, it is so simple. It's so simple. Man has a tendency to complicate things, but it really is simple. It's just as simple as the 10 Commandments here from the get-go. Moses says God is testing you. He wants to know who actually wants to follow him. The Lord comes along and he says, we know all the verses, he who believes, right? He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. Now, how much of a hash have people made of that verse over the centuries? Just think about that idea. How much of a problem people have with that. And it's just, you just go through everything. Whether it's our worship, whether it's salvation itself or service. I'll suggest this. Don't play around with God's law. Don't play around with it. You can tell when Jesus comes on the scene, they were really playing around with it. Look in Exodus chapter 20. And what I'm thinking of is when you come up to the Gospels and it talks about Corban. What you had Jews teaching and saying was, if we keep the first handful of commandments, right? If we keep those first commandments, then we do not have to do verse 12 about honoring your father and mother. Right? If I serve the Lord, if I worship the Lord, if I dedicate this money to the temple, then I don't have to take care of my own mother and father. I don't have to honor them. You don't think that qualifies for playing around with God's law? Well, if I keep the first 5 commandments, do I really have to keep number 7? That's effectively what was going on, amongst other things. Here, looking at this passage, I also wanted you to notice, what is missing from the shall nots, all right? From verse 13, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. You tell someone not to do something, and pretty often, what's their reaction going to be? You tell someone, don't do this, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. A lot of times people are going to say, well, what happens if I do it? Now, just that phrase right there, if someone says, well, what happens if I do? What does that reveal about the person? They have a rebellious spirit. Notice, there is no penalty mentioned. The Lord, and I understand, penalties are going to be laid out later on, right? As more of the law is revealed. But here, initially, there is no penalty mentioned. You shall not, it doesn't say you shall not murder, and if you do murder, then this is what's going to happen. You shall not steal. If you do steal, the Lord doesn't say that. He just says don't do it. Don't do it. To think about why that may be, consider that the laws with their penalties that are going to be laid down later, things are being put in place to govern a nation. Okay? So that concept of governing a nation. So murderers are going to be handled a certain way. Thieves are going to be handled a certain way. Liars are going to be handled a certain way. On and on and on. But spiritually speaking, what is the penalty? What is the penalty for sin? It's a common penalty, right? Spiritually speaking, there's not going to be different penalties. You're going to start getting into the territory of James chapter 2. In James 2 verse 10, for whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. The wages of sin is death. It does not matter what the sin is. As the laws are being set up to govern the nation, there may be different penalties within that governance for adultery and for murder. Actually, even the adulterers who are caught in the act, they would be dealt with. But hopefully you understand my point. Spiritually speaking, there's one penalty. The wages of sin is death. The Lord simply says, don't do it. Don't do it. And don't even think of saying, well, what happens if I do? Don't go down that road. There's only one penalty that might be alluded to, and that's verse 7. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Now, does that sound good? That does not sound good. The Lord will not hold him guiltless. So you might think about the idea of what is missing from the shall nots and the reason for that. But you also might consider what the first commandments are about. From verses 2 down through verse 11. What those verses are about, the first half, it's about God. Those verses are about God, and they are about worship, I would suggest. So I wanted you to think about, would it be fair to say that from the very beginning, God wanted them to know that how a person worships God, that it matters. From the very beginning, God is trying to make that abundantly clear to Israel. And for further evidence of that, come up to chapter 32. Come up to the golden calf account. Up in chapter 32. When people saw, verse 1, when people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, come make us gods that shall go before us, for as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Notice that. They say, this man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt. Verse 2, and Aaron said to them, break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people broke off their golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. Then they said, this is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. Wait a minute. They just said, Moses, who brought us out of the land of Egypt, and now they're turning around saying, here's our God that brought us out of the land of Egypt. But what I want you to see is verse 5. So when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. Now that word Lord there is the word Jehovah. This is not the generic word for God anymore. This is the word for Jehovah. Scholars point that out because it's interesting. Aaron knew, and the people knew, it was not this dumb idol that had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They knew that. They weren't, pardon me putting it this way, they weren't idiots. They knew this golden calf had not brought them out of the land of Egypt. They say, Moses brought us out of the land of Egypt, and they had seen the plagues. We've studied about that recently. But Aaron knew, and to just think about to understand what they were doing, and especially Aaron, what he was doing. All you have to do is just think about this idea. How are you going to make a figure of God? How are you going to do that? How are you going to make a figure of the invisible God? How do you do that? You don't. You can't, frankly. You simply cannot do it. So what you do is you make an animal. You make a figure, you make an animal, and you tie it in with Jehovah, right? You tie it in, you say, tomorrow is a feast day to the Lord. So everything will be okay then, right? As the golden calf is made, and Aaron says, well, it'll all be all right because tomorrow we'll have a feast to the Lord. Does how a person worships, does it matter? The how. To think about that question that I would suggest is imperative. If how we worship does not matter, if how a person worshiped back then did not matter, then why give the first half of the Ten Commandments? If how worship matters, if worship doesn't matter, if it doesn't matter how a person worships, why give those first commandments? And what you see is it very much does matter. It mattered then, and it matters now. That idea that we're probably going to have to work on, that idea of how we worship matters. I'll put it this way. If it does not matter what church, because understand the difference between this religious group and other religious groups. There's several differences, but one of the big differences is how do we worship? And if it does not matter what church, right? If it does not matter what church, then it does not matter if it is this church. Then I truly can go anywhere I want to and worship however I want to, if how we worship does not matter. At some point, you have to get into the nitty-gritty of it. You have to get into the nitty-gritty. You have to look at false doctrines. You have to look at false teachings. And you have to look at what other places are doing for worship. And you have to say, is that biblical? We take the Lord's Supper for granted. To think about the Lord's Supper on the Lord's Day. You go almost any place else in town, right? Not last week, today. You go almost any other place in town, and are they going to offer the Lord's Supper? Today. Not on Easter. Today. They're not going to do it. You go almost any other place in town, and what are you going to find accompanying the singing? you know what you're going to find. How do y'all feel about praise dancers and praise bands? You don't want me up here dancing around. It won't be pretty. But that's what folks have. Just think about worship and how it matters. Here in Exodus, come back to chapter 20. After the 10 Commandments were given, just think about this concept. In Exodus 20, look at verse 22. Then the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, you have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make anything to be with me. Gods of silver or gods of gold you shall not make for yourselves. He's repeating himself for emphasis' sake. Yeah, we know what's going to happen. Verse 24 says, an altar of earth you shall make for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I record my name, I will come to you, and I will bless you. And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone. For if you use your tool on it, you have profaned it. That concept of, if you're going to build an altar, if you make an altar of stone, you are not going to use a single tool of yours to carve on that stone. And the concept is, do you really think you can build anything better than God has already built? Do you really think you can design anything better than what Jesus has already built? Do you really think you can outsmart the Lord? Well, yeah, but times change. You don't think the Lord understood that? If times really do change, or is it actually there's nothing new under the sun? No, the Lord, to look at that concept, we're not going to build anything better than the Lord. And how God is worshipped matters. Always has, always will. Now, like I said at the beginning of the lesson, the list, we're going to be looking at the Sabbath, because it's within the Sabbath where we see the difference between the lists. And to think about it, I want you to just stay here in Exodus. But I want to put up on the screen, this is the Deuteronomy account. Okay? And it's interesting to look at the accounts. Here in Exodus 20, look at the reason for the Sabbath. There in verses 8 through 11. And specifically, it's verse 11. Right? This is the reasoning. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So where does he take them back to? He takes them back to creation. That's where he takes them. But in the Deuteronomy account, this is the reason. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. One takes them back to creation, back to Eden. The other one takes them back to Egypt, remembering they're not slaves anymore. They're not in bondage anymore. So as the Sabbath was being set up that Saturday, as the Sabbath is being set up, this is the reason. So why do you have the two differences? And to think about the reasoning behind it, and to think about what the Lord is trying to convey, you might just consider the Sabbath, right? And he says, in 6 days you shall do all your work. The seventh day, you're going to rest. And the reasoning to think about both accounts, it might come down to this. The Lord is saying, I did not deliver you from Egypt so that you could keep acting like a slave. Right? He's saying, I delivered you from bondage. They had cried out because the taskmasters were oppressing them. And here he's laying it out and he says, listen, on that seventh day, which this is to think about the establishment, on that seventh day, rest, have faith, trust in the Lord, hallow it, all those ideas. He's saying, I did not deliver you from Egypt so that you could keep acting like a slave. I did not create you for that. Because that's what he's saying. He takes them back to creation. I did not create you for that. Follow my example. I want you to think about that idea of God resting on the Sabbath. Y'all remember when your children were real young? Just babies. If your son or daughter, if they were fussing, if they were crying, and they would not rest, as parents, what would you do with them? Right? You ever lay down with your children to get them to rest? Why did you do that? Why would you lay down with your baby? You might think about that figure. Did God need to rest? Did God need to rest? And I understand the idea, well, it just means he stopped working. Okay. But he takes them back to that account and he says, listen, the reason that I want you to keep the Sabbath is because I kept the Sabbath. Follow my example. You might just think about that figure of parents laying down with a child. It is not for the parent's benefit, it is for the child's benefit. You might consider it. Another difference between the Exodus and Deuteronomy passage. There in verse 8 of Exodus, it's remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. But here in Deuteronomy, the New King James is observe the Sabbath. Observe. Other translations are remember. So you have that idea of remember or keep, observe, all those ideas. King James is keep it, I believe. That word there, what it literally means, this figure, I believe it's the Deuteronomy one, it literally means to put a hedge around it. Keep it. Literally put a hedge around it and protect it. That's literally what the word means. You might think about that figure, because I would suggest that's what a person has to do, that word for observe there. That's what a person has to do with anything that is hallowed. I think there should be misspelled hallowed there. You have to keep it. You have to guard it. You have to remember it. For the Jews back in the Old Testament, they could not let the Sabbath become just like any other day. It was set apart. It was holy. And they were commanded to guard it, keep it, remember it. All those things factor in. That's what we have to do with everything that is hallowed. That's what we have to do with everything that is sanctified. We cannot let that which is holy become common. We cannot do it. One of the lessons of the Sabbath here. And the reason that the Jews had to do that with the Sabbath is because the Sabbath was for them. The Lord explains this. Mark 2:27, he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was never meant to be a burden for the people. It was meant to be a relief from burden. That's the whole point of the Sabbath. To just think about what we've already said. Just think about that figure of the parent with the child. It is good for the child. Here, the Lord laying it down. It is good for the individual. It was good for their family. It was even good for their animals. It was even beyond that good for any strangers that may be with them. Right? They were all commanded, keep the Sabbath. I would suggest within the commandment, you also see accountability. Because of that verse about you're not going to do any work. You're not going to, your son's not going to, your daughter's not going to, your employees aren't going to, your servants, even your animals, even the stranger. Now, who's going to be responsible for that? What does Joshua say to Israel before he dies? As for me and my house, Joshua understood accountability. When Eve, in the garden, Eve was deceived, right? We know that, says that. But when they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden, and the Lord comes to them, and I understand they both ate of the fruit, but Adam did not eat first. Eve ate first. She gave it to her husband Adam. When the Lord comes looking for answers, who does he come to? He comes to Adam. That's who he comes to. You might think about the accountability factor here as the Lord is laying it out. They were commanded to keep the Sabbath, to remember it. And the individuals, he says, you don't work, and don't make them work either. It's an interesting account. Go ahead and come up to Deuteronomy as we start wrapping up. Come up to Deuteronomy 5. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, before we have, and the commandments are given from verse 6 and on, but I wanted to read what leads up to that, what led up to that. Deuteronomy 5, verse 3. The Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, those who are here today. You might think about that figure. We might mention that again here in a second. But with us, those who are here today, all of us who are alive, the Lord talked with you face to face on the mountain from the midst of the fire. I stood between the Lord and you at that time to declare to you the word of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire, and you did not go up to the mountain. He said, and then you have the Ten Commandments. But just that figure of Moses saying, I stood between the Lord and you. What is that a figure of? It's a mediator. I stood between. You remember what Moses says? From the people, who is going to rise up? God will raise up a prophet like me. And we know who that was. That's going to be Jesus. As much as Moses was a mediator, Jesus is a much better mediator. He's a much better mediator. As we think about it, the prophet like Moses who rose up, mediator of a better covenant. Go ahead and come up to Colossians, where our scripture reading was. Up in Colossians chapter 2. And I'd like to read the passage again. And I know Sunday night, late, it's going to turn into an English lesson. Sorry. I know. Oh, don't turn it into an English class. I know. But look in Colossians chapter 2. What I want you to notice as we read the passage, I want you to notice the pronouns that are used. Because there is going to be a discernible pronoun shift at a certain point. Okay? This is Colossians chapter 2. You might think about who we're speaking to. Verse 11. In him you were also circumcised, with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you also were raised with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead, and you being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh. So who are we talking to? The uncircumcision of your flesh. We're talking to Gentiles, right? We're talking to Gentiles who are there in Colossae. You being dead, and just notice, verse 11, in whom you were also circumcised, this is talking about baptism, right? Buried with him in baptism, in which you also were raised, verse 12, and you, verse 13, being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he is made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us. We go from you to you to you to us. Having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. That handwriting of requirements, how is it against the Jews? And the question is, when Paul says us, is that referring to us Jews? Or is he saying us, encapsulating both Jew and Gentile, and saying us? The handwriting of requirements that was against us. Because the handwriting of requirements that was contrary to us, as it says, how was it against the Jews? It's because what did the old law not offer? Even in the old law, you could find mercy in such things as that. But the blood of bulls and goats does not take away sin. And no man had kept the law. No Jew had kept the law. Right? All had sinned. The whole point of those first few chapters in Romans is that all had sinned, Jew and Gentile. So it was against the Jews because they hadn't kept the law. How was it against the Gentiles? And that's why I wanted to mention that verse when Moses says, God is making this covenant with us. He did not make it with our fathers. He's not making this covenant with other peoples. He's making this covenant with us. And as long as that covenant was made just with those people, then who's excluded? It's the Gentiles. You have God's covenant people, and you have everybody else. God showing a difference. You might think about, God may have dabbled in the affairs of other nations. When Jonah goes to Nineveh, do you remember what Jonah actually told Nineveh? Did Jonah go to Nineveh and say, and God came down on Mount Sinai, and there Charlton Heston was with the tablets of stone? Is that what Jonah said? I'll tell you what, Jonah didn't even tell the Ninevites to look at it. He didn't even say, if you repent, the Lord will have mercy on you. Jonah didn't even say that. All Jonah said was, God's going to destroy you. That's what Jonah said. So, was God dabbling in the affairs of Nineveh? Yes, to a degree, of course. But is that the same thing as revealing his law to them? No. That's Israel. That's Israel. God dabbled in the affairs of Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar. Does that suddenly mean the Babylonians were God's covenant people? No. No. I would suggest not. The Gentiles were outsiders. That is how the handwriting of requirements was not only against the Jews, it was also against the Gentiles. They were excluded. But now that Jesus has gone to the cross, we have chapter 3 at verse 10, as it talks about that we have put on the new man who is renewed in knowledge according to the image of him who created him, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian. Most commentators who write about that, it seems like they talk about that's basically, if you were not, how they viewed the barbarians. And the point simply being, whether it's Jew, Gentile, whether it's circumcised, uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, didn't matter anymore. That now all who call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. As we offer the invitation, and as we tie that in, to look at number 264, go ahead and switch it over. Whosoever heareth. What is it that made that possible? It wasn't Moses on Sinai. It was Jesus at the cross. That's what makes it possible. Whosoever heareth shall shout the sound. In Acts chapter 2, as Peter was preaching there in Acts 2, as the Holy Spirit was revealing things, whoever calleth upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. For the promise, it's not just to you, it's to you and your children and to all who are afar off. How is that possible? It's because the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, was taken out of the way, and it was nailed to the cross. And now whoever calleth upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And we know what that is. As we turn from our sins, as we are baptized for the remission of those sins, confessing Jesus Christ as Lord and the Son of God. That is the invitation for you this evening. As we think about, as we've been talking about the Ten Commandments, and we recognize, even here in Colossians, we recognize things changed at the cross. We're not under the old covenant. We're not under the old law. Those things that were to bring life actually brought death. We were condemned under the old law. It's not until Jesus that we see grace and mercy, true grace, true mercy, because it's there we see the forgiveness of our sins through the Messiah. If you're here tonight and need to respond to the invitation, please come while we stand and sing 264.